There comes a moment in every believer's life when the outside looks fine, but the inside is falling apart. You're smiling in public, functioning at work, serving at church, but deep down, your spirit is worn, fractured, and weary. You're not broken because you're weak. You're broken because life has been heavy. And the problem is not that we don't love God. The problem is that we often try to fix spiritual damage with worldly tools. Only God can mend what life has torn. The Bible reminds us that God is near to the brokenhearted and saves those who are crushed in spirit. Notice, it doesn't say he waits for you to fix yourself first. He draws near while you're broken. That's good news because peace is not found in escape, distraction, or control. Peace is found in connection. Prayer is not a religious ritual. It is a divine repair shop. When you pray, you are not informing God of what he doesn't know. You are inviting him into places you've been carrying alone. Prayer is where wounded souls are stitched back together. It's where chaos bows to God's order. It's where anxiety is exchanged for assurance, but prayer only works when it's honest. God cannot mend the spirit you pretend is fine. You don't need polished words, you need surrendered hearts. When you say, God, mend my spirit, you're saying, I can't fix this on my own anymore. And that confession is not failure, it's faith. Inner peace does not mean the storm disappears. It means the storm no longer controls you. Jesus didn't calm every storm immediately, but he always brought peace to those who trusted him in the boat. When prayer becomes your first response instead of your last resort, something changes. Your circumstances may look the same, but your spirit is strengthened. Your heart becomes anchored. Your mind becomes guarded, and your soul begins to rest. God specializes in restoration. He doesn't just patch you up, he renews you from the inside out. And when your spirit is mended, you can walk with clarity, love with patience, and endure with hope. So today, don't ask God to just fix the situation. Ask him to mend you. Because when God restores the spirit, peace follows. Spiritual wounds require spiritual solutions because not every injury bleeds and not every battle shows up on the surface. Some wounds live in the soul. They form quietly through disappointment, betrayal, unanswered prayers, prolonged waiting, and seasons where God feels silent. You can still function, still show up, still smile, but inwardly something is fractured. And the mistake many people make is trying to treat a spiritual condition with natural remedies. We live in a world that offers many coping mechanisms, but very few cures. When the spirit is wounded, the world prescribes distractions. Stay busy, scroll longer, work harder, entertain yourself until the pain dulls. Others suggest control. If you can manage every detail, then you won't feel so unsettled. Some turn to pleasure, others to isolation, others to achievement. But none of these reach deep enough because they were never designed to heal the spirit. The spirit is the part of you that connects with God. And when that connection is strained, no external fix will be sufficient. You can change your environment and still feel empty. You can improve your finances and still feel anxious. You can fix relationships and still feel restless. Why? Because spiritual damage doesn't respond to surface level solutions. When the soul is injured, only the one who created it knows how to restore it. This is why God often allows us to reach the end of ourselves, not to punish us, but to reveal the limits of our substitutes. He lets the distractions fail. He lets the control slip. He lets the noise quiet down so we finally hear what's been true all along, that the wound is deeper than we thought and we can't heal it ourselves. Many believers struggle here because they love God, yet they still attempt to solve spiritual pain independently. They pray occasionally, but they rely primarily on human strength. They seek God for outcomes, not healing. They want God to change the situation, but God wants to address the condition of the spirit navigating that situation. Spiritual wounds come from spiritual disconnections. When trust is shaken, when hope is deferred, when fear goes unchecked, the spirit weakens. And just like a physical injury left untreated becomes infected, a wounded spirit ignored becomes heavy. That heaviness shows up as irritability, exhaustion, loss of joy, or constant worry. You may not call it spiritual pain, but its symptoms are undeniable. God never intended you to carry spiritual weight alone. He designed prayer not as a religious obligation, but as a lifeline. Prayer realigns the soul with its source. It's where the Spirit breathes again. But prayer only becomes effective when we stop using it as a last resort and start using it as the primary response. A spiritual solution requires spiritual surrender. That means acknowledging that some things cannot be fixed by effort, logic, or time alone. Time doesn't heal all wounds. God does. Time can cover pain, but only God can cleanse it. When you bring a wounded spirit to Him, you're not just asking for relief, you're submitting to restoration. The danger of ignoring spiritual solutions is that we normalize brokenness. We say, this is just how I am now. But God never intended trauma, grief, or disappointment to become permanent residents in your soul. Healing doesn't mean you forget what happened. It means what happened no longer controls you. God's healing works from the inside out. He addresses motives before methods, hearts before habits, spirits before circumstances. And sometimes that's frustrating because we want fast relief, but deep repair takes intentional surrender. God doesn't rush restoration because He's not just fixing pain. He's rebuilding trust, strengthening faith, and deepening dependence. When spiritual wounds are met with spiritual solutions, something shifts. Peace doesn't come from the absence of problems, but from the presence of God within the problem. Strength doesn't come from having answers, but from knowing the one who holds them. And clarity doesn't come from controlling outcomes, but from yielding control. Ignoring the spiritual dimension of pain leaves you managing symptoms instead of receiving healing. But when you invite God into the wounded places, you're allowing the great restorer to do what no human solution ever could. Reach the deepest part of you and begin the work only He can do. Prayer is not a ritual. It is a relationship. And misunderstanding this is one of the greatest reasons people struggle to experience peace. Many approach prayer as a spiritual task to complete rather than a connection to pursue. They measure prayer by time, words, or posture instead of by intimacy. When prayer becomes a routine, it loses its power, not because God stops listening, but because the heart stops engaging. Rituals can be performed without expectation. Relationships cannot. A ritual says, I did my part. A relationship says, I stayed connected. And God has never been interested in hollow performances. He desires presence, honesty, and trust. Prayer was never meant to be a monologue delivered to heaven. It was designed as communion and ongoing exchange between a loving Father and His children. When prayer is reduced to a checklist, it becomes mechanical. People pray because they feel obligated, not because they feel invited. They repeat familiar phrases, rush through requests, and leave unchanged. Over time, frustration grows. They wonder why prayer feels dry, why peace feels distant, why God seems silent. But the issue is not God's absence. It's the absence of relational depth. Relationships require vulnerability, and prayer demands the same. God is not impressed by polished language or spiritual vocabulary. He responds to truth. When prayer becomes relational, it moves beyond asking God to fix problems and starts allowing God to reveal what's happening within. It becomes less about outcomes and more about alignment. A relationship with God through prayer reshapes how we see Him. Instead of viewing God as distant or demanding, prayer reveals Him as near and attentive. The more time spent in honest prayer, the more trust develops. And trust is the foundation of peace. You cannot rest in someone you don't trust, and you cannot trust someone you never engage. Many people avoid relational prayer because it exposes the heart. It's easier to recite prayers than to confess fears. It's easier to ask for blessings than to surrender control. But surface-level prayer produces surface-level peace. Deep peace comes when prayer becomes a safe place where nothing is hidden. Relational prayer also changes how we list. Prayer is not only about speaking, it's about attentiveness. In a real relationship, communication flows both ways. When prayer becomes relational, silence is no longer awkward, it becomes sacred. Stillness becomes an opportunity for clarity, correction, and comfort. God often speaks most clearly when we stop filling the space with words. Prayer as relationship means consistency over convenience. You don't build closeness through occasional encounters, you build it through continual connection. Not every prayer will feel powerful, but every prayer deepens familiarity. Over time, the Spirit learns to recognize God's voice, God's peace, and God's direction. This kind of prayer doesn't always remove circumstances, but it redefines them. Problems are no longer faced alone. Decisions are no longer carried without guidance. Fear loses its grip because confidence grows, not in outcomes, but in God's presence. The soul becomes anchored, not because life is predictable, but because God is faithful. When prayer is relational, disappointment doesn't drive you away from God. It drives you toward Him. You stop running from Him when things go wrong and start running to Him. That shift alone transforms the inner life. Anxiety decreases not because questions disappear, but because companionship replaces isolation. Relational prayer also transforms obedience. When prayer is merely ritual, obedience feels forced. But when prayer is relationship, obedience becomes trust in action. You fall our God not out of fear, but out of confidence in His character. You know Him, and because you know Him, you trust where He leads. Peace grows naturally in relational prayer because peace is a byproduct of closeness. The closer the connection, the greater the security. The deeper the trust, the steadier the heart. Prayer, when understood as relationship, becomes the place where the Spirit finds rest, alignment, and renewal. Ritual may check a box, but relationship changes a life. And when prayer becomes relational, inner peace is no longer something you chase, it's something you carry. Honest prayer invites divine healing because God works in truth, not pretense. Many people pray with guarded hearts, offering God edited versions of themselves, carefully worded, emotionally filtered, and spiritually polished. They say what sounds faithful while hiding what feels fearful. But healing cannot take place where honesty is absent. God does not heal what we conceal. There is a difference between talking to God and opening yourself before God. Talking can remain surface level, but opening requires vulnerability. Honest prayer is not disrespectful, and it is not faithless. In fact, it is one of the highest expressions of faith because it assumes God is safe enough to receive the truth. When you pray honestly, you are declaring that God can handle your confusion, your anger, your disappointment, and your doubt. Many believers struggle with honesty in prayer because they fear saying the wrong thing. They worry that expressing frustration might offend God or reveal weakness. But God already knows the condition of the heart. Silence does not protect you from Him. It only distances you from healing. The Psalms reveal a pattern of raw honesty, questions, complaints, sorrow, and hope existing in the same breath. God did not reject those prayers. He preserved them. Pretend prayers may sound spiritual, but they do not transform the soul. When prayer becomes performance, it creates distance instead of intimacy. God is not moved by spiritual language. He is moved by surrendered hearts. The power of prayer is not in how eloquently it is spoken, but in how truthfully it is offered. Honest prayer also dismantles self-reliance. When you admit fear, you stop pretending to be in control. When you confess weariness, you stop carrying weight that was never meant to be yours. Healing begins the moment pride gives way to dependence. Saying, God, I can't do this is not weakness. It is an invitation for divine strength. God's healing is often blocked not by unwillingness on His part, but by resistance on ours. We ask God to change circumstances while hiding the wounds those circumstances created. We pray for relief without surrendering the pain. But God heals from the inside out. And honest prayer gives him access to the places we usually protect. There is also a refining aspect to honest prayer. As truth is expressed, clarity emerges. What felt overwhelming becomes defined. What felt chaotic becomes named. Honest prayer brings alignment between what is felt and what is believed. It creates space for God to correct false narratives that have taken root in the heart, lies about worth, fear, and abandonment. When you speak honestly before God, you allow him to speak honestly to you. Conviction flows from relationship, not condemnation. God does not expose wounds to shame you. He exposes them to heal you. And healing often begins with acknowledgement. Until pain is named, it remains powerful. Once it is surrendered, it becomes manageable. Honest prayer also develops endurance. When emotions are brought into the light, they lose their destructive force. Fear loses intensity when spoken. Grief softens when shared. Doubt weakens when confessed. God meets honesty with presence, and presence strengthens the soul. This kind of prayer requires courage because it means letting go of the image of having it all together. But God has never asked for perfection. He has asked for truth. The more honest the prayer, the deeper the healing, the more open the heart, the greater the restoration. Divine healing is not always instant, but it is always intentional. God may not remove the struggle immediately, but he will restore stability, peace, and hope along the way. Honest prayer does not change God's character. It changes our capacity to receive what he is already willing to give. When honesty replaces performance, prayer becomes a place of healing rather than obligation. And when healing begins, the spirit grows lighter, the heart grows stronger, and peace becomes possible. Not because life is easy, but because nothing is hidden from the God who heals completely. Inner peace is stability, not the absence of storms, because peace was never promised as a life free from trouble. Many people equate peace with calm surroundings, predictable outcomes, and resolved problems. But that definition is fragile because it depends entirely on circumstances behaving the way we want them to. The moment pressure arrives, that kind of peace collapses. True inner peace is not built on what is happening around you. It is anchored in what is happening within you. Storms are inevitable. Challenges, losses, delays, and disappointments are part of life. Faith does not cancel storms. It redefines how they are experienced. Without inner peace, storms dominate thoughts, emotions, and decisions. With inner peace, storms still exist, but they no longer control the heart. Stability becomes possible even when clarity is absent. Peace is not passive resignation. It is active trust. It is the settled confidence that God remains present and purposeful even when circumstances feel chaotic. This kind of peace allows the soul to remain steady while everything else feels unstable. It does not deny reality. It faces reality without surrendering hope. Many people chase peace by trying to eliminate discomfort. They avoid hard conversations, delay difficult decisions, or escape emotionally whenever tension rises. But avoidance does not produce peace. It produces fragility. The strength of peace is revealed not in comfort, but in endurance. Peace proves itself when the pressure increases and the heart remains grounded. Inner peace functions like an anchor. An anchor does not stop the storm, but it prevents drift. Without peace, emotions pull the soul in every direction. Fear today, frustration tomorrow, despair the next. With peace, the soul remains connected to a steady foundation. That foundation is not personal strength or positive thinking. It is trust in God's character. This peace does not come from understanding everything. In fact, many storms come with unanswered questions. Peace allows the heart to rest without explanations. It is the assurance that even when the path is unclear, God's presence is constant. Peace says, I don't know how this will turn out, but I know who is with me. Stability through peace also reshapes reactions. Instead of responding impulsively, peace creates space for wisdom. It slows the mind, guards the heart, and tempers emotions. When peace is present, decisions are made with clarity rather than panic. Words are chosen carefully. Actions are guided by purpose rather than fear. This kind of peace must be cultivated. It grows through consistent trust, surrendered prayer, and a willingness to rely on God daily. Peace weakens when trust is replaced by control. The more tightly we try to manage outcomes, the more anxious we become. Peace flourishes when control is released and dependence deepens. Storms often reveal where peace is rooted. If peace disappears the moment life becomes difficult, it was never anchored deeply. But when peace remains through uncertainty, loss, or waiting, it proves its source is stronger than circumstances. That kind of peace does not numb pain. It stabilizes the soul through pain. Inner peace also carries a quiet confidence. It does not need to prove itself or demand reassurance. It rests in the knowledge that God is actively at work, even when results are not visible. This confidence does not remove grief or frustration, but it prevents them from becoming overwhelming. Living with inner peace transforms endurance into growth. Storms no longer feel wasted. They become places where faith matures and trust deepens. Peace allows the heart to learn rather than collapse, to grow rather than retreat. It creates resilience, not because life is easier, but because the soul is stronger. The absence of storms is temporary, but the presence of peace is sustainable. When peace is rooted in God, it remains accessible in every season. It becomes a steady companion through uncertainty, a stabilizing force through change, and a quiet strength through hardship. Inner peace does not wait for life to settle. It settles the heart while life unfolds. A mended spirit leads to a transformed life because inner restoration always produces outward change. God never heals the spirit merely to provide comfort. He heals it to bring alignment, purpose, and renewed strength. When the spirit is restored, it reshapes how a person thinks, responds, and lives. Transformation does not begin with behavior modification. It begins with spiritual renewal. A wounded spirit distorts perspective. It causes people to react defensively, withdraw emotionally, or operate from fear. Even good intentions can be overshadowed by unresolved pain. But when God mends the spirit, clarity begins to replace confusion. The heart becomes receptive instead of guarded. Decisions become thoughtful rather than reactive. Healing at the spiritual level reorders the entire inner life. Transformation is often subtle at first. It shows up in patience where frustration once lived, in hope where despair once dominated, in humility where pride once protected pain. These changes are not forced, they are fruit. A restored spirit produces new responses because it is rooted in a renewed source of strength. What once felt exhausting now feels manageable because the weight is no longer carried alone. A mended spirit also restores identity. Many people unknowingly define themselves by their wounds, what they survived, what they lost, or what went wrong. Pain becomes a reference point, but spiritual healing breaks that pattern. Identity shifts from damage to purpose, from survival to calling. God does not erase the past, but he redeems it, transforming pain into testimony and weakness into dependence on him. This inner restoration affects relationships profoundly. When the spirit is wounded, relationships often suffer. Unhealed pain produces mistrust, impatience, or emotional distance. But when God heals the spirit, love flows more freely. Forgiveness becomes possible. Grace replaces resentment. A healed spirit does not demand perfection from others because it rests in God's sufficiency. Transformation also impacts endurance. Life does not become easier, but the soul becomes stronger. A mended spirit can withstand pressure without collapsing. It can face uncertainty without panic. It can endure waiting without losing hope. Strength rooted in God produces resilience that circumstances cannot steal. When the spirit is restored, obedience changes in nature. Instead of feeling burdensome, obedience becomes an expression of trust. The heart follows God, not out of obligation, but out of alignment. Direction becomes clearer because the noise of fear and insecurity has been quieted. A healed spirit recognizes God's voice with greater confidence. Purpose also becomes more evident. God restores the spirit not only for personal peace, but for influence. A transformed life becomes a witness. Others notice the stability, the patience, the hope that remains even under pressure. Healing becomes visible through character, not performance. The life reflects God's work without needing to announce it. Spiritual restoration brings freedom from constant striving. Many people exhaust themselves trying to prove worth, earn approval, or maintain control. A mended spirit rests in God's acceptance. That rest fuels healthy effort rather than frantic striving. Work becomes purposeful. Service becomes joyful. Life becomes more balanced. This transformation does not mean perfection. A healed spirit still experiences emotion, disappointment, and struggle. But those experiences no longer define the person. They are processed through trust instead of fear. The spirit remains anchored even when emotions fluctuate. God's work of mending is ongoing. Restoration is not a single moment. It is a continual process of renewal. Each season invites deeper trust, greater surrender, and stronger faith. As the spirit remains connected to God, transformation continues naturally. A mended spirit does not just survive life, it lives it with clarity, strength, and purpose. When God restores the inside, the outside begins to reflect his peace, his power, and his presence in every area of life. Surrendering control to God opens the way for true restoration because many of the struggles we face are intensified by our insistence on managing everything ourselves. The human spirit was not designed to bear the full weight of life alone, yet we often take on responsibilities meant for God's hands. We try to control outcomes, manipulate circumstances, and force solutions according to our timing. While effort and planning are necessary in life, the heart that refuses to yield to God becomes weary, anxious, and frustrated. True healing and inner peace begin when we recognize the limits of our control and allow God to lead. Control gives an illusion of security, but it is temporary and fragile. When we insist on dictating every step, we build a structure that collapses under pressure. Our mind races with worry, our heart tightens with fear, and our spirit becomes restless. Even small setbacks feel catastrophic because we have placed our hope in our ability to manage instead of in God's faithfulness. Surrender is not weakness, it is acknowledgement of our dependence on a sovereign and loving God. It is the recognition that he knows the beginning, middle, and end of every situation, and that his understanding surpasses ours. Surrender does not mean passivity or indifference. It does not mean ignoring responsibilities or abandoning effort. Rather, it means aligning our will with God's will, releasing anxiety about what we cannot change, and trusting him to work even when the way forward is unclear. Surrender is a conscious decision to stop carrying burdens that are too heavy for human strength and to invite God's presence and power into the areas we cannot manage alone. This act of faith creates space for restoration because God's work is most effective in hearts that are open and yielding. Many believers struggle with surrender because it feels like loss. Letting go of control can be frightening because it exposes us to uncertainty. We worry that things will go wrong if we do not manage them ourselves. But this perspective overlooks the truth that the weight we carry is not ours to bear. God's promise is that he sustains, protects, and provides. When we release control, we do not enter chaos. We enter God's order. We trade anxiety for trust, fear for faith, and exhaustion for divine strength. Surrender is closely linked to obedience. When we yield to God's authority, we demonstrate trust in his character and his timing. This obedience is not always convenient, and it often requires patience. We may have to wait for answers longer than we like or take steps that do not make sense to our human reasoning. Yet each act of surrender builds resilience and deepens faith. The spirit that learns to trust God in small matters will find it easier to trust Him in the larger storms of life. Surrender also fosters humility, which is essential for spiritual healing. When we try to control everything, we implicitly suggest that we know better than God, that we are capable of solving problems that are ultimately beyond human ability. Humility, on the other hand, recognizes our limitations and affirms God's sufficiency. Healing begins in humility because it allows us to receive what we cannot produce on our own. By admitting that we cannot fix every broken place, we invite God's transformative power to enter where we are weak. The process of surrender changes the way we approach prayer. Instead of dictating outcomes, we ask for guidance, strength, and alignment with God's will. Prayer becomes less about demanding results and more about opening the heart. The act of letting go becomes an exercise in trust, teaching the spirit to rest even while life is uncertain. Inner peace grows naturally in a surrendered heart because God's presence replaces the need to control. The soul experiences stability not from circumstances, but from reliance on a faithful God. Surrender also reshapes perspective. When we stop striving to manage everything, we notice God's hand at work in small and large ways. We become aware of provision, protection, and guidance that were invisible when our attention was consumed by worry. The spirit that surrenders begins to see setbacks as part of God's plan, challenges as opportunities for growth, and waiting as preparation for fulfillment. Restoration is not just the absence of brokenness, it is the presence of God's steadying power. Ultimately, surrendering control is a daily decision, not a one-time event. Each day brings new circumstances that tempt the heart to seize control again. Every unanswered prayer, every delay, and every difficulty is an invitation to release grip and trust God more fully. The spirit that practices surrender consistently becomes resilient, stable, and receptive to God's restoration. Through surrender, the soul learns that peace and healing are not earned through effort, but received through trust. It is in yielding to God that the spirit is mended, the heart is calmed, and life begins to reflect divine strength and clarity.